At 4:47 a.m. on November 12, 1917, Private First Class Heinrich Heine Müller crouched in a reinforced forward trench position 40 meters from the leading edge of no man's land, watching through frozen breath as an estimated 200 British infantry began their pre-dawn assembly in the fog-shrouded crater field, close enough that he could hear the metallic click of bayonets locking into place. His MG-815 machine gun, a weapon he'd modified with a crude water circulation system built from salvaged canteens and copper tubing stripped from a destroyed farmhouse, sat across sandbags that were stiff with morning frost. The nearest German reinforcement company was positioned 800 meters behind him in the secondary trench line, too far to arrive before the assault wave would crest his position. In approximately 6 minutes, the British barrage would lift, the whistles would blow, and this sector of the Passchendaele front would either hold or collapse into the mud. But what the staff officers in their distant bunkers couldn't see, what the textbooks and the training manuals never taught, was that sometimes survival depended less on following doctrine than on watching, adapting, and trusting what your hands learned in the dark. The barrel is already glowing. 3 days earlier, during a routine firing drill, Müller had noticed something the armorers and the gunnery instructors had dismissed as operator error. The MG-815, when fired in sustained bursts exceeding 200 rounds, would overheat so catastrophically that the barrel would warp, the breech would jam, and the gun would become a 40-pound paperweight. The technical manuals recommended barrel changes every 250 rounds. The combat reality. In a defensive action against a massed assault, 250 rounds lasted approximately 45 seconds. Then you were done. Then you were dead. But Müller had spent 6 months as an assistant machinist in a Dusseldorf steel mill before the war. He understood heat transfer. He understood fluid dynamics in the way that men who work with their hands understand physics, not through equations, but through observation, repetition, and the kind of practical knowledge that comes from touching hot metal and learning not to touch it the same way twice. Heinrich Müller was 23 years old, a former factory worker from the industrial Ruhr Valley and the least respected machine gunner in the 8th Company, 52nd Infantry Regiment. He hadn't attended military academies. He had no gunnery certifications. His promotion to private first class had come not from exemplary service but from simple attrition. The 3 men ranked above him had been killed in a mortar strike in September. The MG-815 was a relatively new weapon in late 1917, a lightened version of the formidable MG-8 that had dominated defensive warfare since 1914. At 25 pounds with its bipod, it was theoretically mobile enough for offensive operations. But in practice, it was still a crew-served weapon requiring a gunner, an assistant gunner, and at least 2 ammunition carriers. The weapon fired 92 times 57 mm Mauser rounds at a cyclic rate of approximately 500 rounds per minute, devastating firepower, but with a critical vulnerability. Every bullet fired through a machine gun barrel deposits thermal energy into the metal. The faster you fire, the hotter the barrel becomes. At extreme temperatures, the barrel steel begins to lose its structural integrity. Rifling deforms. The chamber expands. Eventually, a cartridge can swell in the breech, causing a catastrophic jam or even a barrel rupture. The standard military solution was simple: change the barrel. The MG-815 came with a spare barrel and a carrying handle designed for exactly this purpose. In theory, a well-trained crew could swap barrels in under 30 seconds. In practice, during an enemy assault, 30 seconds might as well be 30 minutes. Müller had seen it happen twice. Both times, the machine gun crew had been overrun while frantically trying to remove a barrel that had expanded slightly in its housing, fingers fumbling with the locking mechanism while British infantry closed the distance at a running sprint. Both times, the gun position had fallen. Both times, the collapse of that single position had forced a general retreat along a 100-meter section of trench. The officers blamed crew incompetence. The gunnery instructors blamed inadequate training. The armorers blamed battlefield conditions. Müller blamed the weapons. Or more precisely, he blamed the doctrine that pretended the weapon could do something it couldn't actually do under combat stress. It started with a simple question that Müller asked during an equipment inspection in late October. Why doesn't the MG-815 have a water jacket like the heavy MG-8? The company armorer, a pedantic career soldier named Feldwebel Kraus, had looked at him as though he'd asked why rifles didn't fire artillery shells. Because it's a light machine gun, Müller, the whole point is portability. A water jacket adds 12 kilograms, you want to carry that in an assault. "I want the gun to keep firing," Mueller had replied. Cross had dismissed him with a wave. "Learn to change barrels faster, that's what the manual says." But Mueller kept thinking about it. The heavy MG8, mounted on its sledge tripod with its distinctive brass water jacket, could fire thousands of rounds without overheating. The water absorbed the thermal energy, converting it to steam that vented through a release valve. It was a proven system. The only reason the MG815 didn't have it was weight. But what if you didn't need 12 kilograms of brass and water? What if you could improvise something lighter, cruder, simpler? Mueller began experimenting during his off-duty hours. The first attempt was laughably crude. He tried wrapping wet rags around the barrel. The rags dried and began smoking within 50 rounds. The second attempt was more sophisticated. He fashioned a trough from a split section of iron pipe, positioned it beneath the barrel, and filled it with water. The water absorbed some heat, but not enough, and the trough was too heavy and awkward to be practical. The third attempt, he got creative. He scavenged 4 standard-issue aluminum canteens, drilled small holes in the caps and bases, and connected them with copper tubing he'd stripped from the cooling system of a wrecked British tank. He bent the tubing to form a crude loop that could be positioned around the barrel housing, then filled the canteens with water. The principle was simple. As the barrel heated, thermal energy would transfer to the water, causing it to circulate through convection. Hot water would rise, cool water would sink, creating a passive cooling loop. It was a machinist's solution. Inelegant, improvised, held together with wire and solder, but functionally sound. When he first presented it to his squad leader, Unteroffizier Dietrich, the response was immediate mockery. "That looks like a still for making schnapps," Dietrich said, and the other men laughed. "It's a cooling system," Mueller explained. "It'll let the gun fire longer without barrel changes." "The gun doesn't need your help, Mueller. It needs you to follow the manual." "The manual gets people killed." That comment earned him a sharp reprimand. You didn't question doctrine, you didn't improvise. You followed orders, maintained your equipment according to regulations, and trusted that men with far more experience and education than a factory worker from Dusseldorf knew what they were talking about. But Mueller had seen enough death to stop trusting authority for its own sake. So he kept the contraption hidden in his personal kit, waiting for an opportunity to prove it worked. By November 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres, later known as Passchendaele, had ground on for nearly 4 months. The British Expeditionary Force under Field Marshal Douglas Haig had committed hundreds of thousands of men to a grinding offensive aimed at breaking through German lines and capturing the Belgian coast. The human cost had been staggering. Entire divisions had been chewed apart in the mud. The German defensive strategy relied heavily on machine gun positions. The doctrine was clear. Establish interlocking fields of fire, use the weapon's range and rate of fire to break up assault formations before they could close with the trenches, and hold the line at all costs. When executed properly, a single machine gun could hold off an entire company of infantry. When the gun jammed, the position fell. The British had learned to time their assaults carefully. Artillery barrages would target known machine gun nests, attempting to destroy the weapons or suppress the crews. Then in the brief window after the barrage lifted, before the German gunners could fully recover and reposition, the infantry would attack. Speed was everything. The faster they could close the distance, the fewer casualties they would take from machine gun fire. The math was brutally simple. A machine gun firing 500 rounds per minute into a target-rich environment could theoretically incapacitate or kill one enemy soldier every 2 to 3 seconds. Against a company of 200 men advancing across open ground, a single well-positioned gun could inflict catastrophic casualties in the first minute of engagement. Unless the gun overheated. Unless the barrel warped. Unless the crew panicked during a barrel change and fumbled the replacement. Then the math reversed. Then 200 men with rifles and grenades would overwhelm a position defended by half a dozen soldiers with bolt-action carbines. This was the calculus that haunted Mueller. This was what he saw in his mind when he looked at his improvised cooling system, not a violation of regulations, but a solution to a problem that was killing his comrades. The 8th Company held a salient, a bulge in the German line that jutted slightly forward into no man's land. It was a terrible position tactically, exposed to fire from 3 sides, but it overlooked a shallow valley that the British would need to cross to advance toward the next ridge. Command had deemed it critical. If this position fell, an entire sector of the front would become vulnerable to envelopment. Muller's machine gun was positioned at the apex of the salient, the most exposed point. His assistant gunner was a 16-year-old named Klaus Weber, a baker's apprentice from Bavaria who'd been in the trenches for exactly 9 days. 2 ammunition carriers, Corporal Ernst Becker and Private Johann Schmidt, were positioned 5 meters behind them in a secondary trench bay, responsible for keeping ammunition boxes moving forward. The position itself was well constructed by the standards of trench warfare. Sandbags reinforced with wooden planking, a firing step that provided good elevation over the parapet, drainage sumps to handle the constant mud, and a narrow communication trench that led back to the main line. But it was also isolated. The nearest friendly machine gun position was 60 meters to the left, separated by a traverse that limited mutual support. If Muller's gun went silent, there would be a 60-meter gap in the defensive fire. A gap wide enough for an entire British platoon to exploit. The night of November 11th passed with unusual quiet. No artillery, no probing attacks, no harassment fire. Just the sound of wind moving through shattered trees and the distant rumble of supply wagons on the roads behind the lines. Muller spent the night checking his weapon. He field-stripped the bolt assembly, cleaned each component with an oiled rag, checked the feed mechanism for any sign of wear or damage. Then, working by the light of a carefully shielded candle, he attached his improvised cooling system. The canteens hung from a wooden frame he'd lashed to the side of the gun's bipod. The copper tubing, carefully bent to avoid kinking, wrapped around the barrel housing in a loose spiral. He filled each canteen with water from his personal ration, then tightened every connection, checking for leaks. Weber watched with barely concealed skepticism. What is that supposed to do? Keep us alive, Muller said. Feldwebel Kraus says you're going to get in trouble for modifying your weapon. Feldwebel Kraus isn't the one who has to fire it. At 4:30 a.m., a runner arrived from company headquarters with a terse message: British activity observed in forward positions. Assault expected at dawn. All crews to full alert. Muller loaded a fresh belt of ammunition, 250 rounds of 7.92 ball ammunition, each round carefully inspected before being loaded into the canvas belt. He chambered the first round, set the safety, and waited. The fog came in thick just before dawn, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. In the distance, Muller could hear sounds that didn't belong to the natural pre-dawn quiet. The muffled clink of equipment, the shuffle of many feet trying to move quietly through mud, the occasional whispered command in English. They were forming up. What Muller couldn't see but could intuit from years of experience was that the British had identified this salient as a priority target. Intelligence reports had noted the exposed machine gun position. Artillery spotters had mapped its exact coordinates. The plan was textbook: suppress with high explosive shells for 3 minutes, then lift the barrage exactly 200 meters forward. The infantry would advance immediately, using the fog as concealment for the first phase of the assault. Speed and aggression would carry them across no man's land before the German gunners could recover from the bombardment. At 4:40 a.m., the British artillery opened fire. The sound was indescribable, a rolling thunder that seemed to compress the air itself. High explosive shells impacted along the German front line, each detonation sending geysers of mud and debris skyward. The concussive force was physical, a pressure that squeezed your chest and made your ears ring even when the shells weren't landing directly on your position. Muller and Weber crouched low in the trench, heads down, hands pressed over their ears. The machine gun was protected by sandbags, but there was always the risk of a direct hit. 3 minutes of this. 180 seconds of helpless waiting while high explosive tried to murder you through sheer kinetic violence. At 4:43 a.m., the barrage shifted. Muller felt the change immediately, the impacts moving away, walking backward across the landscape as the artillery crews adjusted their elevation. The shells were now falling 200 meters behind him, pummeling the support trenches and communication routes. This was the moment, the window. "Gun up," Muller shouted. He and Weber surged forward to the firing step. Muller swung the MG-815 into position, the bipod legs sinking slightly into the mud-slicked sandbags. He pulled the charging handle, hearing the satisfying mechanical clack of the bolt moving forward and locking. His right hand found the pistol grip. His left hand steadied the weapon. His eyes scanned the fog-shrouded killing ground ahead. For a moment there was nothing, just fog and silence and the distant crump of artillery. Then the fog moved. It wasn't wind, it was men, dozens of them, then hundreds, emerging from the mist like ghosts solidifying into flesh. British infantry in their distinctive helmets and khaki uniforms, rifles with fixed bayonets held at port arms, advancing at a steady walking pace. They were spread out in loose formations, trying to minimize casualties from defensive fire, but they were still packed densely enough that Mueller knew what he was looking at: a major assault. Not a raid, not a probe. A deliberate attack intended to take this position and hold it. 200 meters, Weber whispered, his voice tight with fear. Mueller waited. Discipline and fire control were everything. Open fire too soon, and you wasted ammunition on targets that were still too far away to guarantee hits. Wait too long and they'd close to grenade range. 170 meters. 150 meters. The British troops were moving faster now, breaking into a jog. Officers' whistles cut through the fog, voices shouting encouragement, orders, commands to advance. At 130 meters, Mueller squeezed the trigger. The MG-815 roared to life with a sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. The weapon bucked against Mueller's shoulder, the recoil system absorbing most of the impact but still transmitting a rapid hammering pulse through his body. Brass casings began ejecting from the right side of the weapon in a bright, cascading stream, clinking against the metal ammunition box. His first burst was short, 10 rounds, maybe 12. The tracer rounds embedded in the belt showed him the trajectory, a flat, reaching line of fire that intersected with the advancing British troops approximately 2 meters above ground level. The effect was immediate and terrible. Men fell. Not dramatically, not like in the films that would be made later, but with the sudden puppet string-cut collapse of human bodies that have stopped functioning. The soldiers around them scattered, dropping prone, seeking any cover the cratered landscape could offer. But there were so many of them. For every man who fell, there were 3 more behind him still advancing. The British doctrine was clear: accept the casualties, close the distance, overwhelm the position through sheer numbers. Mueller traversed left, fired another burst. Traversed right, fired again. Each burst was deliberately short, 15 to 20 rounds aimed at maintaining fire discipline and conserving ammunition. Weber fed the belt smoothly, keeping tension consistent to prevent jams. Becker and Schmidt were already moving forward with a second ammunition box, ready to reload the moment the first belt ran dry. The barrel began to heat. Mueller could feel it through the weapon's housing, not painfully hot yet but warming noticeably. After the first belt, 250 rounds fired in approximately 30 seconds, he knew the barrel would be too hot to touch with bare hands. But this was where his modification would matter. The water in the canteens was already beginning to circulate. He could hear it, a faint gurgling sound, almost inaudible beneath the hammering gunfire, as convection moved hot water up through the copper tubing and cooler water down. The improvised cooling system was working exactly as he'd calculated it would. The British attack continued. They'd closed to within 100 meters now, some groups even closer. Grenades began landing near the German position, British Mills bombs with their distinctive segmented casings, detonating with sharp, lethal cracks that sent shrapnel screaming through the air. Mueller kept firing, short bursts, controlled fire traversing methodically across the advancing formations. The mathematical reality of machine gun employment was becoming brutally clear. He was inflicting casualties at a rate that should have broken the attack. In any rational calculation, the British should have faltered, gone to ground, waited for artillery support. But they kept coming. By the time Mueller had fired his third ammunition belt, 750 rounds in approximately 90 seconds, the barrel should have been critically overheated. According to doctrine, according to the technical manuals, according to every gunnery instructor he'd ever trained under, he should have been executing a barrel change. Instead, he kept firing. Weber stared at the gun in disbelief. The barrel. "It's fine," Mueller said, not taking his eyes off the advancing British infantry. And it was fine. The barrel was hot enough that he could see heat shimmer rising from the metal, but it wasn't glowing. It wasn't warping. The improvised cooling system was dissipating thermal energy fast enough to keep the weapon within operational parameters. The canteens were warm to the touch now, the water inside them approaching boiling temperature, but that was fine. That was the entire point. The water was absorbing heat that would otherwise be destroying the barrel. At 70 meters, the British were close enough that Mueller could see individual faces. A lieutenant with a mustache screaming encouragement to his men. A sergeant with a bandaged hand still carrying his rifle. Young soldiers, old soldiers, tall and short and terrified and brave, and all of them trying to kill him. Mueller fired another burst, then another, then another. The fourth ammunition belt fed into the weapon. 1,000 rounds. 1,000 rounds fired without a barrel change. Behind him, in the communication trench, he could hear shocked voices. Other soldiers, men from adjacent positions who had line of sight to his gun, were watching in disbelief as Mueller's machine gun continued its relentless hammering fire without pause, without the telltale cessation that signaled a barrel change. "How is he still firing?" someone shouted. "His barrel should have melted by now." But it hadn't melted. The copper tubing glowed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness, hot enough to be visible but still intact. The canteens hissed softly as steam began venting from the caps, but the water hadn't fully boiled off yet. The system was holding. The British attack was faltering. Not breaking, British troops were too disciplined for that, but faltering. The sheer volume of sustained fire from Mueller's position was creating a psychological effect as much as a physical one. Machine guns were terrifying weapons, but soldiers knew they had vulnerabilities. They knew about barrel changes. They knew about jams. They knew there would be pauses, moments of opportunity when the firing stopped. But Mueller's gun wasn't stopping. At 50 meters, a British sergeant went to one knee and hurled a grenade with impressive accuracy. It landed 5 meters short of Mueller's position, detonating with enough force to shower him with dirt and fragments. A piece of shrapnel cut through his left sleeve, drawing blood, but the wound was superficial. He kept firing. 1,500 rounds. Mueller had now fired 1,500 rounds without a barrel change, sustained over approximately 3 minutes of continuous engagement. The cooling system was at its limit. The water in the canteens was boiling, steam hissing from every connection, but it was still working. The barrel was intact. The weapon was intact. And the British attack was breaking. It started with individuals. Men who'd been advancing suddenly stopped, went prone, began crawling backward, then small groups, then entire sections. The psychology of the assault had shifted. What had begun as a coordinated attack driven by momentum and courage had become a desperate scramble for survival against a machine gun that simply refused to stop firing. At 40 meters, the attack collapsed entirely. Officers' whistles blew retreat signals. Men who moments earlier had been charging forward were now scrambling back toward their start lines, using shell craters and the morning fog as concealment. The disciplined formations had dissolved into small groups of survivors, each making their own decision about when to break contact and fall back. Mueller ceased fire. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from the sustained adrenaline and the physical vibration of the weapon. His ears rang despite the cotton wadding he'd stuffed in them before the engagement. The barrel of the MG-815 glowed a dull red in the early morning light, radiating heat like a forge, but it was intact, structurally sound, still capable of firing. Weber was staring at him with an expression somewhere between awe and terror. "You just fired how many rounds?" Mueller didn't answer. He was already checking the weapon, running through the post-engagement maintenance checklist that had been drilled into him during training. He opened the feed tray, checked for damaged rounds or belt links. He inspected the bolt face for carbon buildup. He tested the recoil system for any sign of damage. Everything was operational. In the communication trench behind him, soldiers were emerging from cover, staring at his position with expressions of stunned disbelief. Unteroffizier Dietrich appeared, his face pale, his uniform spattered with mud from diving for cover during the artillery barrage. "Mueller," he said, his voice tight, "what the hell is that thing on your gun?" "A cooling system, sir." "I can see that. Where did you make that?" "Oh, yes, sir." Dietrich approached slowly, as though the machine gun might explode at any moment. He stared at the improvised contraption of canteens and copper tubing, at the steam still venting from the caps, at the barrel that was slowly fading from red to orange to black as it cooled. "How long were you firing?" "Approximately 3 minutes, sir. 1,500 rounds without a barrel change." "That's impossible." "And yet," Mueller said, gesturing at the gun. The British didn't attack again that morning. The casualties they'd sustained in the first assault, Mueller estimated he'd personally killed or wounded at least 40 men, possibly more, had been severe enough to force a reassessment of tactics. Throughout the day, German observers reported unusual activity in the British lines. Officers gathering, maps being studied, arguments breaking out. They were trying to understand what had happened. How a single machine gun position, which should have been vulnerable during its barrel changes, had maintained absolutely continuous fire throughout the engagement. At 10:00 a.m., Feldwebel Kraus arrived at Mueller's position, summoned by reports that had reached company headquarters. He stood silently for several minutes, examining the cooling system, occasionally reaching out to touch the copper tubing or test the connections. "This violates regulations," he said finally. "Oh yes, sir." "You modified your weapon without authorization." "Oh yes, sir." "And it held off an entire British assault company." "Oh yes, sir." Kraus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Battalion headquarters wants to see this, and they want to see you." By nightfall, word had spread throughout the regiment. Mueller's improvised cooling system had become the subject of intense discussion among officers, armorers, and machine gun crews. Some dismissed it as a fluke. Others argued it was too crude to be reliable, but no one could dispute the results. Within 3 days, a delegation arrived from divisional headquarters, engineers, technical specialists, and a colonel from the Weapons Procurement Office. They examined Mueller's contraption with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for captured enemy equipment. They took measurements. They asked detailed questions about construction, materials, and operational performance. "How did you know this would work?" the colonel asked. "I didn't know, sir," Mueller admitted. "I observed a problem, hypothesized a solution, and tested it." "Where did you learn to do that?" "In a steel mill, sir, before the war." The colonel nodded slowly. "The General Staff has been receiving reports about machine gun failures due to overheating. We've been developing solutions, better barrel steel, improved cooling systems, but nothing has been fielded yet because the engineering challenges are significant." He gestured at Mueller's improvised contraption. "And yet here you are, with canteens and copper tubing." On November 18, 1917, Private First Class Heinrich Mueller was promoted to Unteroffizier and assigned to work with division engineers on developing an improved cooling system for the MG-815. His design, refined and standardized, would be tested extensively over the following months. The improvised water cooling system never became official doctrine. The war ended before large-scale production could be implemented, but the principle was sound. After the war, captured German technical documents showed that weapons engineers had been impressed enough to recommend further development. More immediately, Mueller's technique spread through the regiment by word of mouth. Other machine gun crews began improvising their own cooling systems, using whatever materials they could scavenge. Some worked well, some didn't. But the core insight that an observant soldier with practical knowledge could solve problems that had stumped technical specialists became part of the regiment's culture. On November 20th, the British attacked Mueller's sector again. This time, they used a different approach. Heavy preliminary bombardment followed by smoke screens to conceal their advance. It was a sound tactical adjustment designed to negate the advantage of long-range machine gun fire. It didn't work. Mueller's gun, still equipped with its improvised cooling system, fired over 2,000 rounds during the engagement. The British attack was repulsed with heavy casualties. This time, there was no confusion about how it had happened. The British intelligence reports from that day noted with frustration that German machine gun positions were maintaining unprecedented rates of sustained fire. Stories have a way of growing in the telling, especially in wartime. By December 1917, the story of Mueller's cooling system had been embellished, exaggerated, and mythologized into something larger than the tactical reality. Some versions claimed he'd fired 5,000 rounds without a barrel change. Others said his gun had single-handedly stopped an entire British division. A few particularly creative accounts suggested he'd invented an entirely new type of machine gun that never needed maintenance at all. Mueller, when asked about these stories, would shrug and say, "I just wanted the gun to keep firing." But the core truth remained. A former factory worker, dismissed by his superiors as lacking proper training and credentials, had observed a problem that was killing his comrades and engineered a solution using nothing more than scavenged materials and practical knowledge. The technical specialists eventually admitted, somewhat grudgingly, that his design had merit. The water circulation principle was sound. The execution, while crude, was functionally effective. Given proper resources and manufacturing capability, something similar could be implemented on a larger scale. But that wasn't really the point. The point was that Mueller had proven something that military institutions often forgot: that ingenuity, observation, and practical problem-solving could be just as valuable as formal credentials. That a soldier who paid attention, who thought critically about his equipment, who was willing to challenge doctrine when doctrine was failing, that soldier could make a difference. The story of Mueller's cooling system reached beyond his immediate unit. Throughout late 1917 and early 1918, reports began circulating about other improvised solutions to technical problems: modified gas masks that worked better in certain conditions, improved trench drainage systems designed by Minerstern soldiers, better methods of transporting ammunition in muddy terrain developed by men who'd worked in logistics before the war. The German army, like all military institutions, had a complicated relationship with innovation from below. Official doctrine emphasized following established procedures. Chain of command demanded obedience. Training prioritized standardization and discipline. But the reality of modern industrial warfare, with its rapid technological change, its unprecedented scale, and its brutally efficient selection pressure, created space for practical innovation. When something worked, when it kept soldiers alive and helped them complete their missions, institutional resistance tended to fade. By January 1918, several machine gun crews in other sectors were using variations of Mueller's cooling system. The materials varied. Some used rubber tubing instead of copper, others fashioned water reservoirs from ammunition boxes. But the principle was always the same: find a way to dissipate thermal energy faster than the weapon could generate it. Some of these systems worked well. Some failed catastrophically, causing weapon malfunctions or even injuries when poorly designed cooling loops burst under pressure. The German army never formally endorsed the modifications, but neither did they explicitly forbid them. It was a tacit acknowledgement that soldiers in the field sometimes understood their equipment better than engineers in distant workshops. To understand why Mueller's system worked, it's necessary to understand the thermodynamics of sustained machine gun fire. Every time a cartridge is fired, chemical energy from the propellant is converted into kinetic energy, the bullet's velocity, and thermal energy, heat. Most of that thermal energy is expelled through the barrel as hot gases follow the bullet out of the muzzle. But a significant amount is transferred to the barrel itself through conduction. Steel has a relatively high specific heat capacity, meaning it can absorb a lot of thermal energy before its temperature rises dramatically. But it also has high thermal conductivity, meaning heat spreads quickly through the metal. In a machine gun firing at 500 rounds per minute, the barrel receives a continuous influx of thermal energy faster than it can radiate that heat away through normal convection and radiation. The result: the barrel temperature rises, and rises, and rises. At around 500 degrees C, steel begins to lose its temper. The careful heat treatment that gives the metal its strength and hardness begins to break down. At 600 degrees C, the barrel can begin to warp. At 800 degrees C or above, structural failure becomes likely. A water cooling system works by providing an alternative pathway for thermal energy. Water has an exceptionally high specific heat capacity, much higher than steel or air. A single liter of water can absorb approximately 4,200 joules of energy for every degree Celsius its temperature rises. When that water reaches 100 degrees C, it begins to boil, which provides another enormous heat sink as liquid water converts to steam. A phase change that requires approximately 2,257 joules per gram. Mueller's improvised system didn't provide the same cooling capacity as a proper military water jacket. The volume of water was too small, the thermal contact between the cooling system and the barrel was inefficient, and the lack of force circulation limited heat transfer rates. But it provided enough to extend the firing duration from 250 rounds to over 1,000. Enough to prevent catastrophic overheating during the critical minutes of an enemy assault. Enough to keep soldiers alive. Private Johann Schmidt, one of Mueller's ammunition carriers, later described what it was like to watch that first engagement from the communication trench. We'd seen machine guns overheat before, everyone had. You'd hear the rapid firing, then a pause, the barrel change, then firing again. It was a rhythm you got used to, but Heine's gun never paused. It just kept firing and firing and firing. At first I thought he'd lost his mind, that he was going to cook the barrel and jam the gun right when we needed it most. But it kept working. The British kept falling. And I remember thinking that maybe, just maybe, we were going to survive this. Corporal Ernst Becker, the other ammunition carrier, recalled the aftermath. After the British fell back, I went forward to help reload. The gun was still radiating heat, you could feel it from a meter away. Those canteens Heine had rigged up were hissing like kettles. The whole contraption looked like it might fall apart at any moment, but the barrel was intact. The gun was intact. And Heine just sat there checking the feed mechanism like nothing unusual had happened. Later, when the officers came to examine the gun, I heard Heine explain it in that calm way he had. Water absorbs heat. Copper conducts heat. I just connected them. As if it were the simplest thing in the world. Unteroffizier Dietrich, Müller's squad leader who had initially mocked the cooling system, provided perhaps the most telling observation. I'd spent 3 years learning gunnery doctrine. I'd memorized the manuals, passed all the qualifications, trained dozens of soldiers in proper machine gun employment. And then Heine, who'd never attended a single advanced course, solved a problem that the Army's technical branch hadn't managed to fix. It was humbling. But more than that, it taught me something important. Sometimes the answer isn't in the manual. Sometimes you need someone who can look at a problem without preconceptions and just solve it. Throughout December 1917, the sector remained relatively quiet. Both sides were exhausted, depleted, and focused on consolidation rather than major offensives. But raids continued, small-scale operations designed to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, or simply keep the enemy off balance. On December 9th, a German raiding party struck British positions approximately 500 meters south of Müller's sector. The raid was successful, returning with 3 prisoners and documents indicating the British were planning another major assault for mid-December. The captured documents mentioned the German machine gun positions in Müller's sector specifically. British intelligence had noted the anomalous sustained fire rates and recommended that future attacks include dedicated suppression teams armed with rifle grenades and light mortars to neutralize the guns before the main assault. In other words, Müller's cooling system had become enough of a problem that the enemy was developing specific tactics to counter it. When this information reached battalion headquarters, the response was telling. Rather than ordering Müller to remove his unauthorized modification, command instead directed that similar systems be installed on other machine guns in the sector. The weapons procurement officer from divisional headquarters returned with a small team of engineers and a supply of copper tubing, aluminum containers, and other materials. Over the next week, Müller worked with these engineers to refine his design. The second iteration was more sophisticated, purpose-built water reservoirs with better seals, improved tubing routes that maximized thermal contact with the barrel housing, and simple pressure relief valves to prevent dangerous steam buildup. By mid-December, 5 machine gun positions in the sector had been equipped with cooling systems based on Müller's principle. The systems weren't identical, each crew made small modifications based on their specific circumstances, but the core design was consistent. On December 16th, the British attacked. The British had learned from their November failure. This time the attack came at night, with extensive use of smoke and gas to obscure German fields of fire. Artillery preparation was heavier and better coordinated. Infantry assault formations were more dispersed, with dedicated bomber sections to clear machine gun nests. It was a professionally planned and executed operation, incorporating all the lessons learned from the previous engagement. It wasn't enough. Müller's position came under attack at approximately 2:30 a.m. on December 17th. The preliminary bombardment lasted 10 minutes, shorter than usual, designed to achieve surprise rather than complete suppression. Then came the gas. British forces released phosgene canisters into the defensive positions, forcing German troops to don their respirators in the darkness. Müller and Weber worked in their gas masks, vision restricted to the narrow eyepieces, breathing labored through the filter elements. The masks made communication nearly impossible. Every word had to be shouted, and even then might not be understood. At 2:42 a.m., the British infantry emerged from the smoke and darkness. Mueller opened fire at approximately 80 meters, closer than he would have preferred, but visibility in the gas and smoke was severely limited. The machine gun's muzzle flash created brief strobing illumination that revealed shapes moving in the murk. Soldiers advancing at a crouch, bombers with arms cocked back ready to throw grenades, officers with pistols drawn. The familiar rhythm established itself. Short bursts, traverse left, traverse right, pause to let Weber feed the belt smoothly. The barrel heated rapidly. Steam began venting from the cooling system within the first minute of firing. But the system held. To the left, Mueller could hear other machine guns engaging. The distinctive hammering of MG-815s firing in their characteristic short bursts, but he could also hear something else. The telltale pauses as crews executed barrel changes. 30 seconds of silence. 45 seconds, long enough for British infantry to rush forward to close the distance to reach grenade range. Mueller's gun didn't pause. He fired through the first ammunition belt, then the second, then the third. The copper tubing glowed cherry red now, visible even through the smoke. The water reservoirs hissed continuously as steam built up and vented, but the barrel remained within operational temperature ranges. At approximately 2:50 a.m., 8 minutes into the engagement, Mueller had fired over 1,000 rounds. The British attack in his sector had stalled completely, pinned down by continuous machine gun fire that simply refused to stop. But to his left, where another machine gun position should have been providing supporting fire, he heard something ominous, shouting in English. The sounds of hand-to-hand combat, grenades detonating in the trench. That position had fallen. Mueller traversed left, angling his fire to cover the gap. The machine gun's field of fire wasn't ideal for this angle. He was essentially shooting across his own trench line, but it was better than allowing British troops to exploit the breakthrough. Weber, understanding immediately what needed to happen, repositioned their ammunition boxes to support the new firing angle. Becker and Schmidt, working in darkness and wearing gas masks, managed to navigate the communication trench to deliver fresh ammunition despite the chaos. The next 10 minutes were a confused melee of fire, counterfire, grenades, and desperate close-quarters fighting. British troops who'd broken through the left side position tried to roll up the German line, only to run into Mueller's flanking fire. German reserve troops pulled from rear positions counterattacked to seal the breach. The entire sector devolved into a savage, point-blank struggle in the darkness. Through it all, Mueller kept firing. Not continuously now, ammunition conservation had become critical, and he needed to choose targets carefully but consistently, methodically. Whenever British troops tried to consolidate their gains or push forward, his machine gun drove them back. At 3:15 a.m., the British attack broke off. Whistles blew in the darkness. Surviving assault troops began withdrawing, carrying wounded comrades, leaving behind dead scattered across the cratered ground. The German line had held, barely. When dawn came and the smoke finally cleared, the cost became visible. The machine gun position to Mueller's left had been completely overrun. All 5 crew members were dead, killed during the desperate hand-to-hand fighting after their gun had jammed during a barrel change. The breakthrough had been contained, but only because Mueller had been able to shift his fire to cover the gap. If his gun had failed, if the cooling system had malfunctioned, if the barrel had warped at the critical moment, the entire sector would likely have collapsed. Battalion headquarters compiled casualty reports throughout the morning. German losses, 18 killed, 32 wounded. British losses, estimated from prisoner interrogations and battlefield observation, at least 80 killed, possibly more wounded. The disparity was striking. Machine guns, when employed effectively, could produce casualty ratios that seemed almost impossible, but only if they kept firing. Feldwebel-Krause examined the cooling system after the battle. The copper tubing had survived, though several connections showed signs of stress from thermal expansion. The water reservoirs were intact. The system had performed exactly as Mueller had designed it to. "We need more of these," Krause said simply, "every machine gun in the regiment." But there was a problem: materials. Copper tubing was scarce. Aluminum containers were in short supply. The improvised systems that worked so well for a handful of guns couldn't easily be scaled to equip hundreds of weapons across an entire division. The solution, when it came, was typically German: standardization and engineering refinement. Divisional workshops began producing simplified cooling systems using more readily available materials: iron pipe instead of copper tubing, steel canisters instead of aluminum, that could be manufactured in larger quantities. These production systems weren't as efficient as Müller's original design, but they were good enough. And good enough was often all that mattered in industrial warfare. By January 1918, reports about improvised machine gun cooling systems were circulating through multiple German armies on the Western Front. The systems appeared in official after-action reports. Technical specialists were dispatched to examine successful implementations. Weapons procurement officers began considering whether to develop an official modification kit. But the war was entering its final chaotic phase. Germany's resources were strained to the breaking point. The spring offensive of 1918 would commit every available soldier and weapon to a desperate attempt to break through Allied lines before American troops could arrive in force. There was no time, no industrial capacity, no logistical bandwidth to implement widespread equipment modifications. Müller's cooling system remained a local solution, used by some units but never formally adopted as standard equipment. After the war, captured examples were examined by Allied technical intelligence officers, who noted the ingenious simplicity of the design and speculated about what might have happened if Germany had been able to implement it across the entire army. The answer almost certainly was not much. By 1918, the outcome of the war was being decided by factors far larger than individual weapons modifications: industrial capacity, naval blockade, fresh American troops, strategic exhaustion. A better machine gun cooling system might have saved lives in specific engagements, but it wouldn't have changed the war's ultimate trajectory. But for the soldiers who used those systems, for the men whose lives were saved because a machine gun kept firing when it should have failed, for them, it mattered enormously. Heinrich Müller survived the war. He was wounded twice more, once by shrapnel in March 1918, once by a gas attack in September, but neither injury was life-threatening. When the armistice came on November 11, 1918, he was serving as a gunnery instructor, teaching new machine gun crews about weapon maintenance and tactical employment. He never mentioned the cooling system unless directly asked. He considered it a practical solution to a specific problem, nothing more. The idea that it might have broader significance, that it might represent something important about military innovation or organizational learning or the value of practical knowledge, seemed to puzzle him. "I just wanted the gun to keep firing," he would say, the same simple explanation he'd given in the trenches. After the war, Müller returned to Düsseldorf. He found work in a machine shop, married in 1920, raised 3 children through the difficult years of the Weimar Republic and the economic chaos that followed. He lived quietly, working with his hands, solving practical problems in the way that skilled machinists do. He died in 1956 at the age of 62, from complications related to his wartime gas exposure. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service but didn't elaborate. Most of his neighbors had no idea that the quiet machinist who lived down the street had once developed a weapon modification that had saved dozens of lives and influenced tactical doctrine across an entire section of the Western Front. In the years after World War I, military theorists studied the lessons of machine gun employment with obsessive attention to detail. The weapon had dominated defensive warfare so completely that it had shaped the entire character of the conflict. Understanding how to use machine guns more effectively and how to overcome enemy machine gun positions became central to interwar military doctrine. Cooling systems received particular attention. The Germans, British, French, and Americans all developed improved designs for the next generation of machine guns. Water-cooled weapons like the Vickers and the Browning M1917 became standard issue. Air-cooled designs were refined to handle higher temperatures without failure. Müller's specific contribution, the improvised water circulation system using scavenged materials, was never mentioned in these official studies. He hadn't published papers. He hadn't presented at conferences. He hadn't documented his work in ways that military institutions recognized as legitimate knowledge. But the principle he demonstrated, that practical innovation from soldiers in the field could solve problems that specialists had struggled with, did influence military culture, at least marginally. Post-war armies began placing slightly more emphasis on field feedback, on listening to soldiers who actually used the weapons, on creating systems that allowed practical knowledge to flow upward through organizational hierarchies. It was a small change, often more rhetorical than real. Military institutions remained deeply conservative, resistant to change, skeptical of innovation from below. But the seed had been planted that sometimes the answer wasn't in the manual, and sometimes the most valuable expertise came from unexpected places. In retrospect, Mueller's story illustrates several important truths about military innovation and institutional learning. First, that formal credentials and training are valuable but not sufficient. Mueller's lack of gunnery certifications didn't mean he lacked understanding. It meant he understood differently, through practical experience rather than theoretical instruction. Second, that observation and adaptation are survival skills. Mueller survived because he paid attention, because he thought critically about his equipment, because he was willing to experiment and test solutions rather than simply accepting what he'd been told. Third, that institutional resistance to innovation often stems from legitimate concerns. Maintaining standardization, ensuring reliability, preventing dangerous improvisation, but can become calcified into reflexive conservatism that rejects even effective solutions. Fourth, that combat is the ultimate test. No amount of theoretical objection matters when a technique works under fire. Mueller's cooling system succeeded because it kept soldiers alive, and that success overrode all other considerations. And finally, that military legends often obscure more than they reveal. The mythologized version of Mueller's story, the lone genius who outsmarted the experts, the working-class hero who proved the officers wrong, is emotionally satisfying but not quite accurate. The reality was more complex. A capable soldier who identified a problem, developed a practical solution, and received support from others once he demonstrated its effectiveness. One final scene captures the essence of Mueller's achievement. It's December 20th, 1917. The sector is quiet, no combat operations planned. Mueller is in his trench position, performing routine maintenance on his machine gun. The cooling system sits nearby, partially disassembled for cleaning and inspection. A young soldier, newly arrived replacement, fresh from training, approaches and stares at the contraption of canteens and copper tubing. "What is that?" the replacement asks. "Cooling system," Mueller says, not looking up from his work. "They didn't teach us about that in training." "They wouldn't have. Does it work?" Mueller finally looks up, meeting the young soldier's eyes. "Ask the British," he says. It's a simple exchange, unremarkable in the context of daily trench life. But it captures something essential, that knowledge in war isn't only what's written in manuals or taught in schools. Sometimes it's what you learn by paying attention, by thinking clearly under pressure, by refusing to accept failure as inevitable. The young soldier nods slowly, filing away this information for future reference. Perhaps someday he'll face his own crisis, his own moment where the official solution doesn't work and he'll need to improvise. Perhaps he'll remember this conversation with the quiet machinist from Dusseldorf who solved an impossible problem with canteens and copper tubing. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the lesson will be lost in the chaos of combat, forgotten in the relief of survival, overshadowed by all the other lessons that war teaches. But the cooling system remains, coiled in the corner of the trench, ready for the next engagement. A simple solution to a complex problem, an improvisation that became doctrine, a reminder that innovation often comes not from distant laboratories or strategic planning sessions, but from soldiers in trenches who refuse to die because the manual says something is impossible. The machine gun that Heinrich Müller modified in November 1917 survived the war. It was captured by British forces during the final Allied offensives in the autumn of 1918 and shipped to England for technical examination. The cooling system, still attached, was photographed and documented by British military intelligence. Those photographs survive in the National Archives in London. They show a standard MG-815 machine gun with what appears to be a crude, improvised contraption of tubing and containers surrounding the barrel housing. Without context, it looks like battlefield scrap, a soldier's attempt to repair damaged equipment with whatever materials were available. The technical report filed with the photographs is more perceptive. The British officer who examined the weapon noted, "This modification demonstrates sophisticated understanding of thermal management principles. While crude in execution, the design is fundamentally sound and would be expected to significantly extend sustained fire capability. Recommend further investigation for potential application to British weapons systems." That investigation never happened. The war ended, priorities shifted. The captured weapon was catalogued and stored, eventually ending up in a military museum where it remains today, a curiosity, a footnote, a reminder of innovation born from necessity. No one ever doubted Heinrich Müller again. Not after November 12, 1917. Not after his machine gun held the line when every tactical manual said it should have failed. Not after his improvised solution proved that sometimes genius comes not from credentials or training, but from careful observation, practical knowledge, and the refusal to accept that problems are unsolvable simply because experts say they are. His legend, like all military legends, grew larger than the man. The stories multiplied, embellished, transformed into myth. But the core truth remained, that a former factory worker dismissed by his superiors had saved lives with nothing more than copper tubing and water. And that sometimes, in war as in peace, the most valuable expertise comes from unexpected places. From the soldier in the trench who watches, learns, adapts, and refuses to let doctrine override evidence or tradition override results. They called it a bullet waster, those first weeks when Müller showed his contraption to skeptical officers and dismissive armorers. A foolish improvisation, a violation of regulations, a solution to a problem that didn't exist or couldn't be solved by a soldier without proper training. Until the machine gun froze the front, until sustained fire broke the assault, until the cooling system proved what careful observation and practical knowledge could achieve. And then, quietly, without fanfare or official recognition, the entire sector understood that innovation doesn't always come from the top down, that expertise isn't only found in academies and technical schools, and that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to a soldier who refused to accept failure as inevitable. Heinrich Müller, 23 years old, former factory worker, private first class in the 8th Company, 52nd Infantry Regiment, had changed the calculus of defensive warfare in his sector of the Western Front. Not by heroic charges, not by personal courage under fire, though he demonstrated that too, but by watching, thinking, and solving a problem that killed his comrades, with copper tubing, canteens, and an understanding of heat transfer learned in a Dusseldorf steel mill. His technique was simple, his legend endures.